Well, our guest this evening is someone who's been here before, Stuart Tootal, who is one of the most impressive soldiers of his generation, I think you can fairly say. He's credited with having one of the brightest brains in the British Army, as well as being an outstanding warrior, something he demonstrated when he led his men from 3 para into the break-in battle that established British troops in Helmand in the summer of 2006. He's since left the army, which took some people by surprise, as he was tipped to go to the very top. His reasons for that, as he would say himself, are complex, but among them was a feeling that he didn't want to preside over the decline of that institution. It's something that he cares about very deeply, particularly the human side of the army, the welfare of his men. He made himself a gigantic pain in the arse to the collective military political establishment over questions of welfare, the medical treatment that his men received when they got back to the UK, as well as a whole load of other issues about equipment, but also just the general quality of their life. He's now working for Barclays International in the very challenging area of security, and he has recently published a book, Danger Close, which is a fantastic work. I've recently read it. It's full of insights, it's full of emotion, it tells a terrific story, and it's an important and valuable document about the military and its relationship with the civilian world. It's on sale here after the talk is over. I'm just going to say a few introductory questions to get the ball rolling, and then it's over to you. There is a microphone available. Please, will you speak directly into it? This is apparently being broadcast online live, so it will help greatly with the technology if you can actually address the microphone. Thanks very much. Okay, Stuart, I'd just like to start off by asking you a question in relation to what's happening on the political front in Afghanistan at the moment. It's the mantra that's repeated always when soldiers are asked to explain what they're doing there. They say, we're supporting the civilian government. Given what's gone on in the election, do you think that President Karzai deserves that support?
It's certainly challenging in my view that the legitimacy of the current regime, particularly on the back of the elections, is very difficult, because I'm sure everyone's read, not recently, about the difference of opinion between the UN Electoral Complaints Commission about the legitimacy of the election process and also what the IEC is saying in Afghanistan as well. And quite rightly, people are questioning the legitimacy of the Kabul government. But it's what we've got, and I think it is still an improvement, and it's a really caveated term, than certainly what the Taliban were offering in terms of their government from 1996 to 2001. And it's a very immature democracy, and there are lots of problems with it. The key thing is to try and nurture it along, to try and improve the governance. And I don't think it's enough to answer your question specifically to turn around and say, because we don't like the way the government is working at the moment, and there are lots of things wrong with it and lots of things that need to change, that the Afghans don't deserve our support. And whether it's Karzai or Abdullah, I still think it's vitally important that we have NATO troops and obviously British troops in Afghanistan.
You say in the book that you think the conflict is winnable. Winnable is an elastic term, I know, but can you just give a brief recipe for success, given what we have now, what our resources are, and what is actually doable?
Well, I think we first of all have to recognise that victory is going to fall somewhere short of a conventional victory in terms of armies surrendering and a clear political solution when one side has won and the other has lost. But if someone asked for, and I was reading something called the Briggs Plan, and this is when Briggs was sent out to Malaya in 1950, when that campaign was going badly wrong, and there were lots of similarities to what was happening in Malaya that are currently happening in Afghanistan. And you wouldn't go wrong to look at something like the Briggs Plan. I mean, the first thing is you need a sense of unified command and a single purpose, which is very difficult to do when you look at 1950, when it was the Malays and the British colonial administration trying to disengage from Malaya as it withdrew from empire. You don't have that in Afghanistan because it's 41, 42 nations and the Afghans themselves, vitally important. But you do need a greater sense of a common mission and purpose that everyone signs up to, and we can perhaps talk about that. You've got to focus on building up the Afghan security forces, both the police and the army, and that's going to require more troops. And while they take time to reach maturity, which is probably going to take years, you need more NATO troops to clear ground of the Taliban and then hold it for development. And the development is absolutely essential because Afghanistan is both a physical and psychological conflict for the will of the people. And very sadly, the development aid, particularly the UK development aid under DFID, has been very poor. And there are other things you can add on to that: intelligence-driven operations, better use of accommodating, funny enough, which you in Malaya would have called SEPs, surrendered enemy personnel, bringing people who were former antagonists into the fold, because there has to be a cultural Pashtun solution which can't ignore the Taliban dynamic. And then I think finally, and this is probably the most crucial point, if we lose in Afghanistan, it will not be in the arid plains of Helmand province or in the foothills of the Hindu Kush. It will be in capitals like London and Washington. And it's vitally important that the domestic public arena in countries like the US and this country understand and support the mission in Afghanistan. And unfortunately, I don't think we have a publicized, joined-up strategy that makes sense to perhaps many people sitting here.
That's, I think, a crucial point. As you very well know, as we all know, this is a strange there's a strange hybrid public reaction to the war. On one hand, there's great support for the armed forces, admiration for them, which goes hand in hand with deep misgivings about the purpose of the mission. Whose fault do you think it is that the message is not getting across?
Well, ultimately, it's got to lie at the door of our political leaders to stand up. I mean, it'd be an interesting sort of question to throw back to the audience of whether they think that UK PLC has the right priority to Afghanistan. I mean, it's not easy, and I can see the challenge for any politician, because for anyone to really stake their colours to Afghanistan takes a certain amount of personal career risk. And I detect there's a sense of Afghanistan being one of these beasts where people aren't sure which way it's going to go, and it's going to take a certain amount of courage to do that. But what we need to be clear about is there are 18-year-old British soldiers who are showing the right level of courage on a daily basis in Afghanistan. So perhaps people who come from a more privileged background need to take a leaf from their book and properly stake their colours to the mast of why we're in Afghanistan, the fact that it's going to be difficult and complex, but the fact that it's worthwhile doing.
What is the effect of public opinion on the morale of the soldiers? I mean, at what point, if it becomes a very unpopular war like the Vietnam War became in America, do you think that will necessarily impact in a serious fashion on the way business is done there, the way the soldiering is done there?
I think in the longer term it could do, and there's a real risk there. I mean, my sense is, and I obviously talk to a lot of my former comrades, and their view is they're very heartened by the fact that what the armed services go through in somewhere like Afghanistan, how they're treated, is now far higher up both the political and the public agenda. And I think people appreciate that there is a sense of a greater understanding of value of what they do. But I think there are two things I would say on that. First of all, soldiers don't want sympathy, they don't want pity, they just want support. And the second point is that the last thing that they want is the British public to wobble on them now. Earlier today, I met up with a very impressive lady called Hazel Hunt. And Hazel is the mother of Private Richard Hunt, who was the 200th soldier to be killed in Afghanistan. And she turned around to me and said, Richard wouldn't have wanted to be anywhere else except serving with his regiment. I mean, this is what our soldiers do. They accept risk and loss as part of the business they're in. That's why they join the army. And what they're doing in Afghanistan is exactly what they join the armed forces to do. And so the last thing they want is the British public to suddenly start questioning their mission. quite rightly questioning how it's being delivered, have they got the right support, and I think they appreciate that. But they don't want people suddenly turning around and saying, this is the wrong mission that we're in.
Right, I'm now going to open it up to the floor. So if you've got a question, put your hand up. The microphone will be delivered to you. And this lady here.
Hello, Nikki Marks. How do you begin to measure success in Afghanistan? We hear from the British military, I do quite a lot of work in media training with soldiers. So we're here to bring peace and stability to Afghanistan. But what realistically can Britain expect in terms of success? How would you measure success?
Well, I'd probably reduce it initially down to certain areas. And let's take Helmand province, and Afghanistan is more than Helmand province, and there is a difference between north and south as well. But take Musakala, for example, where we had some very difficult experiences there. I'd measure it by the level of violence and the level of fighting. I'd measure it by the number of children going to schools that have been built for them, market and economic activity, employment, how much local support there is for the Taliban. And I think if you secure an area properly, you would find, and admittedly over a reasonable amount of time, that people would turn away from supporting the Taliban if they felt that they were protected from their coercion. So there are a number of metrics where you could build a data argument, and it's about understanding the space of that. I mean, what you're not going to see, and certainly not in the short to medium term, is the sort of metrics that you might apply in a Western European society in terms of number of people voting, etc., etc. Because I think your average Afghan is less concerned about whether he's got the vote. It's whether he can deliver his produce to market, depending on what that is, whether that's opium or something else, that his children can be educated. Because whenever you sat down with a tribal elder and you said, you know, what are your ills in this village? And they used to mention health, particularly female health care. And very quickly after saying security, they would say education for our children. Because although the education and certainly the literacy rates in Afghanistan are very low, they are very conscious that their future is their youth and what they do. So I think, having said that, you can draw out certain parameters as long as you focus on areas. And then the key thing is that you begin to focus on one area, then perhaps another, and they then begin to join up. Does that give you a sense of...
Sort of, but then the problem really is one of sustainability, because you can achieve those things, but you can't necessarily hold on to those things.
Well, I think you can if you bring the right Afghan dynamic into it. And initially it has to be led probably by foreign troops, and not just troops, but development specialists, civil servants, etc. And then what you're trying to do is step away. So it's actually the Afghan people in that area, and particularly their security forces, be it the police or the army, who are then brought up to a level of capability where they're doing it for themselves, and then foreign troops begin to step away.
The gentleman over there next to the wall.
Kavi, Colonel Tootal, I'm a bit intrigued. I understand you are now working for Barclays International. Considering Barclays' reputation in Africa, particularly in South Africa and Zimbabwe and elsewhere, I wonder whether it involves anything, are Barclays involved in financing or funding the security contractors who are the unknown ex-British, American, South African army personnel now on the loose, not only in Afghanistan, but Iraq and Pakistan as well. Forgive me if I don't mean to be rude to you, but you seem to be so, in such a delicate situation. I thought you will be the best person to inquire. You might be aware that in Pakistan during the last 4 or 5 days, in Islamabad, there have been a number of incidents in Islamabad where Blackwater personnel have been set upon by the people on the streets of Islamabad.
Well, I think it's probably important to say I'm not here to talk about my present employment. However, what I would say is that I work in the corporate security sector of the bank, and I know nothing of what you've just suggested. And I think that I would. So there may be other issues about private security, and I'm not in private security, I'm in corporate security. Very, very different in a banking institution than companies like Blackwater, and there is no association or link between my company and those sort of companies. So that is not something that I know about, and I'd like to think that I would know about it given my current role.
This lady over here in the front row.
Thank you. Barbara Emerson. Is it realistic to hope that opium production will be at least drastically reduced and replaced by other cash crops in Afghanistan now?
I don't think it's unrealistic if the alternatives, and it's not just cash crops, it's other alternative livelihoods, if they're realistic and they make sense to the Afghan people who are currently growing opium. I don't think you can completely divorce the production of opium from somewhere like Helmand province. I mean, opium is a really easy crop to grow. Wheat isn't. Wheat, you need generators, you need fuel, you're more susceptible to the vagaries of the environment, etc. So I think just sort of turning around and saying, well, you should grow wheat. I mean, every time we went out into the poppy fields, there were other fields which were full of wheat. So I don't think it's enough to just say, well, they should grow wheat and not opium. The question is, what do you do about the opium? To stop people growing it, you have to make it economically worth their while. And if they are going to grow it, because it's a complex issue, because the production of opium is tied up with a sort of feudal debt bondage of farmers taking effectively loans to grow next year's crop. Sometimes that's legislated against their families as well. So just suddenly saying you can't grow opium has a huge impact, as apart from just not having the cash crop at the end of the day. But there are a number of things that could be considered, not least there is a world demand for opiates. So what is to say that we shouldn't buy some of that opium? It needs to be strictly controlled, and there probably needs to be a certain amount of carrot and stick in how that's managed. But you can play market forces as well. And that's something that I don't think has been explored in enough depth.
Lady in the middle.
I wanted to ask,
Thank you.
who are we talking when we say it's the Taliban? Where are they getting their finance from, and who are supporting them?
I think it's actually quite difficult to apply a completely monolithic label to the Taliban, because their motivations of their constituents will vary. Some of them will be poor farmers who might be fighting because they think it's supporting the poppy crop. They might be doing it because it's a way of earning money. We used to refer to some of the Taliban as $10 Taliban. These were guys who would come up, fire some rounds at us because the Taliban were paying them to do so. Funnily enough, that dropped off quite quickly when they realized the consequences of doing that was that they were losing some of their people. There is definitely probably an unholy alliance between some of the drugs warlords. And then, of course, you've got your hardcore fighters as well, some Afghan-driven and some probably externally. So there's a complex mix of tribalism, traditional resistance to the invader, the Pashtunwali code of martial honor and blood feud. So it is complex, and some of it is driven by tribal politics without a shadow of a doubt. But I actually think that that is a potential opportunity, how you can win certain sectors of the population who might support the Taliban over, depending on what they're being offered. And that it benefits from Kabul, probably a certain amount of autonomy as well. In terms of where they're supported, well, they get a lot of money from opium, and that's one of the reasons that it's really important that we address the opium issue, but not necessarily by outright eradication, for all the obvious reasons. And there are probably some external supporters as well who feel that they are supporting a cause and they're prepared to send money. But they're not supported in the same way that former insurgents have been supported. And I think it was mentioned, in fact, Patrick mentioned the Vietnam War. I mean, let's be clear. The Viet Cong, who were a force of some 75 to 80,000 insurgents operating in the south of the country, were backed by a North Vietnamese army that numbered several 100,000, and indeed the People's Republic of China and also the Soviet Union as well. So I don't think we should be overly concerned that there is some force that is supported, which makes it difficult to defeat it or move it to a position of accommodation. There isn't the same similarity with some other insurgencies as well. And I'm not underestimating the challenge of dealing with the Taliban.
Gentleman there with the blue shirt. Yes.
Chris King. Last week, Sam Kiley was here, who's been with, I can't remember which regiment in Afghanistan.
16 Air Assault Brigade.
And he said one of the reasons that we need to be in Afghanistan is that if we pull out, the Taliban will get strong enough and could then potentially destabilise Pakistan, which might give them access to the bomb. And I'm curious to know what your thoughts are about that.
I think that's a doomsday scenario. That doesn't necessarily mean it's unrealistic, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with Sam. And I mean, someone once said to me, you can't understand Afghanistan without looking through the prism of Pakistan. To tell you the truth, you can't look at the region without considering both Afghanistan in the north and Pakistan in the south. And there's an obvious dynamic, not least that the Pashtun heartland runs across the former Durrand Line, which is a border they don't recognise. But I think we're in a position where we have containment in Afghanistan, and we can question whether it's been as successful as we want it to be. But I think also in Pakistan there has been a growing recognition over probably the last 5 or 6 years that the Taliban cannot be ignored. And certainly the operations which are being conducted in the Swat Valley in the northwest frontier province, but also in the federated tribal areas of southern and northern Waziristan, is beginning to make a difference. And the Taliban are being squeezed from north and south, which to my mind is the beginnings, and I mean early beginnings, of perhaps a positive situation where more extremist elements can be moved towards some form of accommodation. Because you're never going to completely perhaps rule certain parts of that area as you'd wish to. But just to, probably absolutely nail your question on the head is, if we fail both north and fail south, I think the consequences both for regional security and international security could potentially be very extreme.
Gentleman in the corner at the back there.
Hello, James Steele. I was interested in following Panther's Claw, and I don't quite get. I mean, I know it's sort of a preliminary to the election, but I don't think I don't really feel I've got a clear picture of what's really happening on the ground, the overall strategic position. Are we winning? I mean, is it going our way at all?
Well, I think there is. I mean, first of all, British Army is doing a fantastic job. Whether it's got enough equipment or not is a big question mark, and I personally believe that there isn't enough equipment and there are not enough troops there. But they are doing a remarkable job with what they've got. Panther's Claw was designed to clear an area out which roughly is between Lashnagar, round about the centre of Helmand province, and the second principal city of Goresh. And it was obviously a costly operation, because I think at least 22 soldiers were killed and obviously many more were wounded. And one could argue that the benefits were questionable because of the turnout in that area for the elections was quite low. But it did have an effect on the Taliban. And what people need to be clear is, you know, the Taliban are taking a beating. They've been pushed back from the district centres. And I could show you a video clip. Well, I can't because I don't have my laptop here. But we held 5 district centres, which are now currently held and have been stabilised to a certain extent. Well, we were attacked 4 to 5 times every day. Rockets flying into the district centre. Every time a patrol went out, it was ambushed. We were having stand-up fights. I mean, the Taliban were actually forming up against us and launching very nearly conventional attacks onto those district centres, which effectively became battle zones. That's not the case now. The Taliban have been pushed back. So that is an effect and a mark of success. The interesting thing is, though, I don't think it's articulated particularly well, which says probably something about our information operations. They are under pressure. This is why they have moved to a more asymmetric form of attack, which is the roadside bomb. But of course, the roadside bomb is incredibly lethal. It also has a big psychological impact as well. So that in itself is an indication that the operations out there are having an impact on the Taliban. What I think is missing is the back end, is the civil development aid, which then has to come in behind has to fit into the security piece, and that's the bits that's going to win over the hearts and minds of the people, because actually there can't be a military solution, and in a counterinsurgency campaign, often the military line of development needs to be secondary and subordinate.
So, gentleman here.
Bearing in mind the security situation in northern Helmand at the moment, and therefore the unwillingness or inability to get civil servants up to a lot of the hotter zones such as Sangin or Gereshk, what is your view in terms of what the military should be undertaking in terms of non-kinetic operations, be it reconstruction development, governance, information operations, or even outreach medical care to the local community to win the hearts and minds and get things up and running?
Well, it's an area that needs to be hugely improved because it's poor, and the Army's focus over the last 3 years has been on the fighting, the harder side. The softer side has been left to DFID. As I said earlier, I think their record is incredibly poor. And two things need to happen. Either DFID needs to get on the money and do it properly and recognise that that means their people have to go into risky areas, and if they're not prepared to do it, because you need a muscular approach to this sort of winning over the hearts and minds, then give it to the military and give the resources to the Army or the armed services generally to recruit more people, to keep more people in the Army to go and do this. One option might be to look at some form of commercial organisation where people are prepared to take the risk, and they go to Afghanistan and they don't fly back for 2 weeks leave every 6 weeks and then a project stalls, that they stay there. And if they're remunerated properly, someone could perhaps stay there for a longer period of time. Now, I think there are some good people in DFID, but you know, people are talking about, well, DFID doesn't do bricks and mortar issues. That's exactly what an Afghan wants. And so I think the whole development bit needs to be substantially rethought through, because, as I said, it's a battle for the hearts and minds of the people. And even if you had all the military resources you wanted at the end of the day, if you don't win over the people because it's a war for the people, then we're on a hiding to nothing.
Is there anyone here from DFID, actually, or anyone from the development?
Some vigorous arms going up, so there probably is.
Who would want to comment on that? Is that your line of work?
I'm Sharon Cooper-Coles, the UK Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I agree with a very great deal of what Stuart said, but I do question his attacks on DFID and his model of how we're going to win hearts and minds. I don't question the bravery of British soldiers or the professionalism and what they've achieved in Helmand. But the notion that we're going to win the hearts and minds of the people of the Pashtun belt by building them things is, I think, well-intentioned but mistaken. What those people want to know, in my view, is who's going to be in charge of their village and their valley 5 weeks or 5 months or 5 years from now. And they need to be convinced that we're not going to leave them, and that if we go, the Afghans are going to take over, the Afghan authorities are going to stay there and be in charge. And it's all in the end about security and governance. I'm not saying that development isn't important. And it's about sustainability, as the lady in the front row asked. Those are the problems we have to face. If it were just about DFID personnel getting forward, that would be easy. The Americans have contractors crawling all over Afghanistan, dishing out tax dollars. But it's much, much more complicated. And I think DFID has a very fine record in Afghanistan and in Helmand. The new head of our civil military mission there will be a DFID officer, a woman who went on the higher command and staff course at Shrivenham. And unlike the United States, where only 40% of American aid is actually spent in Afghanistan, 90% of your tax pounds is spent in Afghanistan through the Afghan authorities. So I don't pretend our strategy is perfect, and lots of Stuart's criticisms are right, but I wish it were just as simple as delivering development to the people of the Helmand Valley. It's about governance and getting those Ulus Wals governing And that's a tricky business. In a way, it's getting the district officer system going, sort of updated for the 21st century, using what the parachute regiment has achieved to give the Afghans the confidence and courage to govern. Sorry to have gone on for so long. Just one other point, Stuart. You said that unlike the Viet Cong, the Taliban had no sort of external supporter. They do, of course, have one large external supporter in the form of the ISI of Pakistan. And one of our big problems is to get the Pakistanis to see that the Afghan Taliban, as well as the Pakistani Taliban, need to be addressed, and we need to work with them, not against them. And I'm very hopeful that the new Chief of the General Staff, David Richards, who was the ISAF commander, who has a good relationship with the Pakistani generals, will be able to use that to get the Pakistanis pointing in the right direction. Sorry to have gone on for so long.
Well, I think everything you've said has added to the debate. And to come back to you in reverse order, I mean, you're absolutely right. The Pakistan dimension, as I mentioned, is fundamentally important, and I think there is greater recognition in Pakistan. I was there the week before last, that the Taliban are a real issue, and every time the Taliban, as they did on the 27th of May, detonate a bomb in Lahore, that has a real impact. And of course, they saw the Marriott bombing in September of 2008. So absolutely right. It's got to be a joint effort, and I certainly think it would be wrong to sort of somehow lump some sort of responsibility on the Pakistanis and say, you know, there is an issue here and it has to be a joint approach. And so I think that's a very valuable contribution. In terms of DFID, and I've been pretty hard over on DFID, and I make no apology for that whatsoever, and that doesn't mean to say there aren't some very worthy individuals there. But when I was in Afghanistan, and some of you may have heard the washing machine story, I won't go over that again because that seems to make people particularly excited. If you want to get excited about something, lose 15 soldiers killed in action, another 46 wounded. That's something to get excited about. But what I found was, and the Afghans, I think, are very, very practical people, because we went into one village and we were talking to the Malik, the head man, and he brought up this thing about female healthcare, and I thought, well, I can't really help you there because we're paras. We don't really do that. And I said, well, you know, my biggest problem is all my medical personnel are male, virtually all, and I certainly didn't have any female doctors. And this sort of chap turned around and said, well, that's not really a problem. And I said, well, surely it's a problem, you know, cultural sensitivities and all the rest of it. And he said, well, no, we would have a shura, and we would bring in the mullah, and there would be a chaperoning system and all the rest of it. So I'm saying, so I could give you a male doctor, and he could do all the sort of female health things and all the rest of it without going into any intimate details, and that would sort of be acceptable to you guys. And he said, yeah, if it was properly handled and all the rest of it. Well, we never got the opportunity to do that, because we then ended up defending the outstations, and we were completely focused on fighting off Taliban attacks. But the fact is, there wasn't the ability for me to even turn around and say, look, I'm sorry, I've got to focus on fighting or patrolling or whatever it is, or checkpoints on roads. But what I really need now is to parachute in the right, whether it's a civil aid development team or a military team, to meet this immediate requirement. One of the problems you also had up in the Sangin Valley is, and you see it every time you fly on a helicopter, and I have no idea how they survive, but you'll suddenly see a lone figure walking through the desert, and there will be about 100 goats following him, because this is the main staple of meat. And all the goats are mangy and full of worms and pretty unhealthy. And I was talking to a vet who I only met once before, when he was carrying artillery ammunition for us, because that's what we needed him to do at the time. And we were talking about it right at the end of the tour, and he said, if only I could have got forward and taught your guys how to worm goats, that every time you went out on patrol, that Corporal Tommy Atkins has got a pocket of worm pills, and it didn't take, you didn't have to be a rocket scientist to do this. And we could have gone around and we could have wormed goats, and we could have then given the worming tablets. And let's face it, you know, not good for anything else except goats, so they're only going to go to the goats. And we could have made a difference. And we could have also said, by the way, when you run out of your worm tablets, get down to Goresh, here's a leaflet, go and chat to our vet there, maybe take a goat or two along, he'll give you a prognosis of how your treatment's going. Straight away, we'd have begun to make a difference to the Afghan villagers. And instead of turning up and making promises, or talking about high-level Western European-style governance, or even developing agricultural colleges, etc. We could have hit them at a level where they say, you people are making a difference. And I remember an Afghan saying to me once, and he said, don't squander this. You're different to the Russians. The Russians never had provincial reconstruction teams. They made a very late effort at the end of the day, around about 87, 88, but it was far too late then. And they had a completely different reason for being in Afghanistan. So I believe this grassroots approach, which takes real energy, real balls, and a certain amount of risk, is something that we need to push forward, answering your question. So whether it's schools, and a school may not always be the ideal thing to build, but the ability to access the people. It is a war for the people, not amongst them, not against them, for them. And so while I don't disagree with anything that's been said, at the same time, I still think there is a more brassy, make-an-effect approach that needs to be taken.
This gentleman here.
Richard Pendry. I used to be at Frontline News Television, now I'm at the University of Kent. It just struck me so much that with your talk about DFID people should go forward and they should be more involved and forget about the risks quite so much as they have been. And then also this story about the worming tablets and the other things that you could have done, but you actually ended up fighting instead of doing these useful things. It actually seems to me to be an extraordinary admission of military failure, actually, because the whole point of the PRT being established in Helmand in 2006 was to allow DFID to do its work. That was the only reason for the British troops to be there, and they were supposed to be there not to fight the Afghans at all. And actually the Afghans, it seems to me, see that the British troops are actually there to support what is a very unpopular and deeply corrupt government, which steals a huge amount of the money that should be being used to develop the country. I was just wondering how you responded to that.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, are you suggesting that we went looking for trouble? Because having zipped soldiers who've been killed on operations into a body bag, I can tell you now, we may have been paratroopers, but we didn't go looking for trouble. If someone attacks you, and part of the UK mission, which actually, to be fair to John Reed, if you read through his statements, and everyone picks up on the bit of the shot. No, but I'm answering your question, so by all means, please come back to me. There was always the view we would respond robustly if attacked. We were attacked on many occasions, so we responded robustly. We were 1,200 men, where there are now 5 times that number of combat troops.
I don't think it's your fault.
No, I know, and I'm not taking this question personally.
Which was not possible to do, perhaps.
Well, you're absolutely right there, but if anyone... OK, well, take it another way. If anyone thought we were just going
Can I
to...
just say, I'm totally sympathetic
to
the British Army. My brother was the person that was very involved in setting up the PRT in Helmand in 2005, 2006.
But the PRT can only operate if it has the right level of security.
Absolutely.
And I think if anyone thought we were just going to walk into Helmand province without stirring up some form of a hornet's nest, then they're very poor students of Afghan history. Because although we're not the Soviets, although we're not a colonial red-coated army, we were bound to have a reaction. You only had to look at the intelligence which we were seeing, and it was very thin and very poor because it was the beginning of a campaign, so perhaps that's understandable. But we arrived in April. At the end of March, 18 Afghan national policemen had been sent down to Baram Shah, and every single one of them was murdered in a coordinated ambush. 4 regional governors, district governors, had been murdered by the Taliban at the north end of the Sangin Valley. Well, if that wasn't an indicator that when we arrived there was going to be some form of friction. So actually, in some ways, I agree with you. The trouble was the conditions weren't set. And the trouble was that if we had enough troops maybe to look over to the initial part of the mission, which was a rough triangular between Camp Bastion in the west, Goresh to the northeast, and then Lashnagar to the south, it might have been possible to secure that area, start the development there, going back to the answer I gave to this lady here about you focus on certain areas, and then we pushed north to hold where the Taliban were attacking, because that was important to hold the Taliban off. And yes, I know the outstations are contentious, but I think they had some unintended positive consequences. So you're absolutely right, and so perhaps the answer is it's a matter of resources, but it's, you know, it was a joint mission. It goes back to the point I've made that you can't just have a military line as well.
Maybe not, you know, maybe not just resources, but also the numbers of troops and why were they there and what were they trying to achieve and how they were going to bring the Afghan population on board to support it.
The trouble is we're playing catch up. I mean, we took the eye off the ball and focused on Iraq, and I think everyone would agree that was probably the wrong thing to do at probably the front end almost of 2000, when there was a real window of opportunity. The Taliban had been pushed out in a fairly straightforward manner, and the Afghan people were just thirsting for someone to come and make a difference. But we didn't invest the right level of resources, whether it was troops or development aid, because everyone focused on Iraq. So we're playing catch up in Afghanistan. And at least we're there. And while I think some of the initial concept was wrong, the intent was worthy and right, and I think it still is. But the plan needs to be amended and adjusted, and that's beginning to happen, but it needs to go some way further. And what we've also got to do, and this is at the highest political leadership, is to stop turning around and saying, we've got a 60% increase in helicopters. That's meaningless. Just apply the data arguments to the statistics. There are now 300% more troops you need to carry, with a 60% increase in helicopters, where the numbers of helicopters have been increased, and I don't need to talk about numbers because that's not important, but many of the airframes, the aircraft brought in, are old, knackered Sea Kings, which have limited lift capacity. And so, well, we can talk about helicopters if we want. It's just an example of how we're not recognising, okay, we are where we are, there have been mistakes, let's flag up the mistakes, let's look at how we address them. And it probably goes back to your point that right from the get-go, while, as I say, the intent was worthy, the concept and the planning was remarkably poor.
Just on the point of intelligence, Sam Kiley's book, and indeed the same story appears in my book, carries a tale from Mark Carlton-Smith, who did a recce mission to Helmand in 2005, just before you got there, and he reported back to his superiors, there isn't an insurgency in Helmand, but if you want one, we can make one for you. Slightly tongue-in-cheek, but that's indeed was indeed the case. Though it was quiescent, but only because there was arrangements between the local drug lords, the Taliban, who were lying low. Did that information actually come to you? Did Carlton-Smith's report reach you before you went? No, I mean, we didn't see what Mark Carlton-Smith had written, and we weren't aware of it at the time. And I think one also needs to be careful that and this is to be fair to some of the planners, that what happened was they drove into Taliban, and this was the initial PGHQ, recce and planners, and they'd go to a village and they'd say, well, we drove into the village and we met the Malik and we had a cup of chai and we drove out again and it all seems pretty peaceful. It means nothing. It's when you keep coming backwards and forwards. And why should the Taliban take you on when a couple of Land Rovers turn up, they're counting your guns, they want to see what you're doing, and then you disappear and life continues? You've got no permanent presence. As soon as you put a permanent presence down, that's when people get interested. And they either turn around and say the permanent presence is good because it's time specified, it's going to bring benefits, and then you're going to go and you're going to bring or leave improvements behind you. Or they say, no, we don't like this and we're going to fight it. So it's all about the approach you take. And I think there was a huge naivety in the sense that because a few people had rocked around Helmand province, they all went, it's pretty peaceful. Now, you could also argue, well, hang on, if you hadn't gone in there, it would have just bubbled away and it would have been fine. But the last thing we want, and it extends, of course, beyond Afghanistan, and there are issues about Somalia, but it's also about priorities, is ungoverned space. For people who can sit unmolested, uncontained, and can plan attacks, whether it's against this country or it's Lahore in Pakistan. And that's what we would have if we had ungoverned space. So that's why I think it was important to go in. Yeah, okay, put our hands up. The plan wasn't great, but as I said, the intent was worthy and was right. Sorry, this gentleman here in the middle with a copper bracelet.
Ben Walters, Colonel, when you conducted your estimate, when you went into Afghanistan, what additional resources did you ask for? And with hindsight, would you have asked for more?
Yeah, when I did my estimate, and I got in trouble for this, or slapped. Luckily, Mike Jackson came to my rescue. Well, the first thing our estimate told us, we didn't have enough helicopters. So this was back in October 2005, and we went in April. Ed Butler was my brigade commander, agreed, very supportive, so I knew the message was going up from Ed. So helicopters was an issue. I asked the Colonel-in-Chief of the Parachute Regiment to see if he could help. He happens to be a member of the royal family as well, and that didn't go down very well when he then rang up the MOD and asked about it. He was doing his job actually as a military officer and not as the Prince of Wales. We were very, very grateful for it, but it didn't change anything. We knew we didn't have enough helicopters. There was a cap. I think the force levels were 3,700, and then they had to reduce by about 300 to 500 because they're building camps and all the rest of it. My battle group went out light of about 75 people, so even under that cap, we lacked 75 soldiers just to go as a full battle group. So lack of helicopters, lack of radio equipment. We didn't have all the radio equipment that we wanted. We made that very clear. I had a telephone conversation with John Reed, who actually, given his due, said, you know, so the radio equipment's all sorted out, and this is on the back of the 6 RMP who had been killed in the beginning of July 2003 with 1 para. And I said, look, the kit's better. Some of the kit we've got is much, much better. We just don't have enough of it. So we lacked communications, we lacked helicopters, and we lacked manpower, and we were very clear. Now, with hindsight, if someone said, hey, OK, Tootal, you're going to go and do Sangin. Your battle group, 3 para, is going to do Sangin. I'd say, OK, I will need a bit more, but I think I can go and do Sangin, 1 battle group. But to do Nowzad, Musakala, Sangin, Kajaki, Fob Robinson, run bastions, support the Canadians, and also do some of the fighting down in Garmsir, I'd have said, give me an infantry division, which is about 15,000 soldiers. Sorry, does that answer the question?
I take it that option clearly wasn't open to you. You were just captain.
No, no one's going to let me be a divisional commander, as much as I might have wanted to be, but...
Gentleman at the back with the beard.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought up the issues of the PRTs. And we in the humanitarian aid business are very concerned about the continued blurring of humanitarian space in Afghanistan and, of course, in Iraq and before that in Somalia. So, and it's been making our job much more difficult to do. And when I've been in Afghanistan, which has been a few years, people there, as you say, are very practical. So this simple strategy of winning hearts and minds, to me, doesn't really make much sense. When I was in Afghanistan, there was a Christian group giving out bread, and they were making the people say hallelujah. And I was like amazed. And this was right after the person in Shelter Now had been kidnapped. And I went up to the mullah and I said, well, why are you taking this bread? He says, we're not stupid, we're hungry. So I'm just, you know, it's when I hear about development and the Army talking about development or the military, and from the research I've read, there's no evidence that it's any more effective and even less effective than humanitarian aid. Or I'm curious as to what your thinking on this is.
Well, again, you can look back in lessons of history, and in 1969, I think it was the 3rd Marine Corps, US Marine Corps up in Da Nang province, and I might get the formation wrong, but they started a thing called CAPs, which were civil action patrols, I think. There might have been teams, CATs, I can't remember. But what they did was, and this was on the back of Tet, when things were beginning to look very bad in South Vietnam. And what effectively happened, they took these guys, and the Marines made the conscious decision that these would be their best guys, and they lived in the villages with the Vietnamese militia. And suddenly, the rate of violence dropped dramatically, because they could bring security, they brought aid in, and it made a difference. So the point I'm trying to make here is that I think the military has a role to play. Now, I would have been far happier if someone suddenly said, Tootal, here's your battle group, this is what you've got to do. And by the way, these are the development guys. And you're going to do this jointly together, and they're going to live in your headquarters, and you're going to go on patrol together, and they're going to be Afghan experts, and they're going to speak Pashtun, and they're going to educate you about the cultural sensitivities, and they're going to really do their stuff. And they're going to come back and say, hey, Stuart, we really think we can win over a sector of the people, this village, if we just do X, Y, and Z. What we need you to do is provide the security around that, which in a way was the original concept. I would have signed up to that. That would be great. I had no DFID personnel in my headquarters. And the DFID people we had, you know, they weren't allowed to go out. This is not because they didn't want to. But I do think that it has to be done in conjunction, because some of the development, initially the front-end bit in somewhere like Afghanistan right now, has got to be protected. And I think you'd probably agree with me that what you don't want is sort of quasi-humanitarian soldiers protecting themselves, or perhaps even to have private security companies doing that. So I think there's an alliance and a jointness that has to be military and civilian, but quite rightly so. As soon as the security situation lends itself, then the military must step away from the humanitarian bit. But I think where we are in Afghanistan, particularly in somewhere like Helmand province, and this doesn't apply necessarily to the rest of the country, then there needs to be joined up, integrated, and together, and learn from each other.
This gentleman here. Colonel Nick de Boinville. I'd like to make a comment, please, on the DFID issue, which is as follows. I thought the speech was going wonderfully until we were told that 90% of the funds given by the British government go to the Afghan government, and therefore you can divide by 3 the amount that actually gets through onto the ground.
No, that's not what I said. I said 90% was spent in Afghanistan, not through the Afghan government.
I'm sorry, so I thought it all went through the government. Well, that, in which case, it slightly undermines my next point, which was going to be, I'm sitting next to Sarah Fain of the Afghan Connection, who, through private funding, have established no less than 30 schools throughout many of the northern parts of Afghanistan. And the frustration that I have is that there's no government funding to assist in what could only be a constructive measure by any, in any outlook in putting more schools into the country to start the long-term reconstruction of Afghanistan. And I'd be interested if there's a comment in reply to that one as to why the British government is unable or doesn't have the structure at this stage to fund private initiatives to establish schools, etc. My question to you, please, Colonel, is as follows. My own personal view is that the insurgency in Iraq accelerated in no uncertain terms once collateral damage, to use that awful term, started to in turn accelerate with the deaths of many innocents there. And my suspicion is the same has happened in Afghanistan. Do you see any prospect of the current American policy being to throttle back on bombing raids onto villages, etc., such that the crucial hearts and minds war has got a chance of being won instead of incurring more and more civilian casualties, unnecessarily, in my opinion?
I think it's crucial, and this is sort of McChrystal's directive, that people need to think really carefully about bringing kinetic effects of bombs, etc. And I think it's vital, and we took every measure we could to reduce the number of civilian casualties, and undoubtedly we caused some, however tragic that was. And I also saw my soldiers take risk against themselves, either to hold fire off or indeed to go and pick someone up who had been hit in the crossfire. And there was one occasion where we definitely rescued a Taliban boy who'd been hit from far because we'd been engaged, and a patrol went out and got him. And it was very clear to my guys that the target were the Taliban and not the people. And there's a real consequence when you have this collateral damage. But it also has to be balanced against that if you are prosecuting a war, and this is a war, whether it's a counterinsurgency conflict, it is still a war. And it comes back to the softer effects one wants to have as well. When you have to fight, you have to fight. And sadly, inevitably, there will be some collateral damage. The key is to get it to an absolute minimum, to make sure that it's followed up. And I don't know the details about this tanker incident with the Germans, but certainly what I read in the Times today, that it appeared that McChrystal's headquarters had difficulty speaking to the right people about what had happened and all the rest of it. That didn't sit particularly well. And I think it's actually very different in the British camp. I think it is taken exceptionally seriously. But this is one of the challenges you're going to have in a counterinsurgency conflict, that you are conducting a war for the hearts and minds of the people, but of course you're doing it in their living space as well. They're difficult to discern from the Taliban, and don't get me wrong, this is a mistaken identity, but you know, if you're being attacked from a compound and you drop a bomb on that compound and there are innocent bystanders there, you're going to cause casualties, and it's a very, very difficult space to operate in. So I think the intent to gear back, to really question how firepower is used, to be always conscious of the need to avoid civilian casualties is massively important. But I think also it needs to be supported by an information line that when this does happen, as tragic as it is, that people are very clear explaining why it happened, what's being done about it, what lessons are being learned. But you know, let's not lose sight of the fact that while NATO has undoubtedly killed some civilians inadvertently, the Taliban have murdered thousands of Afghans deliberately. And so the way we approach the particular problem is measure, restraint, but also, I believe, setting the context and following the very important information line of operation as well.
That lady there in the blue bullet.
Hi, Joanna Wright. Could I please ask, in terms of hearts and minds, do you think there's a problem in terms of explanation of aims? For example, when there's a lot of discussion before an operation about it being about securing voting sites, when the actual Afghans in that area will turn around and say, look, we don't care about voting, we just don't want to have fighting in our village, or a British minister will come down to Helmand and say, what we need is more girls' schools. And that gets picked up by the Afghan journalists and quite frankly greeted with absolute horror, you know. Or the Canadians will say, we're going to bring policing to the people of Kandahar, when the locals are describing the police as kidnappers. Do you think, I mean, what can really be done in terms of actually explaining the real aims to the Afghan people, so that they're not turned away from the military operations before they begin, please?
Well, I think it's about having an honest expose of aims and intentions that make sense to the Afghans, and the honesty bit is very, very clear. I mean, one of my concerns, and I sometimes have interesting discussions with Christina Lamb, who has very different views to me because of her particular experiences, all of which I respect entirely. And Christina told me a story how she had been driving, and this was the beginning of the year, through Lashnagar, and she had been quite critical of the development effort, and rather sort of proudly they said, well, we've just driven through the bazaar, you know, we can drive through the bazaar, it shows development, advancement of security. And she said, 4 years ago, I used to shop in the bazaar for fruit entirely on my own, which she clearly can't do now. So we're not really being terribly honest, are we? We need to turn around and say, really, what are we trying to achieve here? Let's divorce some of the trappings which makes no sense to the Afghan people in terms of saying, well, we all want to actually allow you to vote. So yes, of course we do, but that's not the priority aspiration. What we're trying to bring in, because we've got this message from you, is that you've got water, sanitation, reduction of infant mortality, crucially security. But we don't major on those themes, and when we talk about security, we don't say how we're going to do that. We're going to do that by this many outposts, this many of trained policemen. You know, the Malays had a concept for their policemen in the service of the people, and the Malaysian police were corrupt, brutal, funny theme to what's happening in Afghanistan, but eventually with the right resources and the right effort, and of course Malaya is going to be easier because it was single colonial administration, not a multinational effort. But, you know, where are the Afghan national police in all of this? So if you turn around to, I think, an Afghan villager and said, look, our aspiration is that maybe in 15 years' time there's a fair, legitimate vote, women's rights. He might wince slightly at that. But in the meantime, we're going to build a strategy of security first, roads, employment for all your people so they don't go and fight with the Taliban, we're going to come to some accommodation with opium, alternative livelihoods, you're going to have clean water, more of your children are going to survive, and we're also going to provide something that's going to meet some of the education requirements as well. And we're doing all that because you've told us that's what you want to do. I think your average Afghan, and there may well be some Afghan people here who may agree or disagree with me, would turn around and say, yeah, that makes sense to me. If I see it and I can believe it, I might just support what you're trying to do on condition that there is a time-limited period when this is then delivered by us and Afghans and not you.
Is there indeed anyone from Afghanistan here? No. Interesting. This gentleman here with the glasses.
Colonel Stuart, my name's Frank Ledwidge. I'm a former military officer and Staff College graduate, and with that hat on, I can't help making the comment that it seems that the British Army has lost the characteristics described by someone I'm sure you know, John Nagle, as a learning institution. And I was wondering before we came how quickly Malaya would come up. Without wishing to get into the details of Malaya, it's neither pertinent nor relevant, I would suggest, to Afghanistan. But my other hat, and perhaps more pertinent to this evening, is I was one of those reviled development advisors in Helmand a year after your deployment. And one of my colleagues was a rather grizzled old RUC veteran. And he described to me one day when we were out, and I think it's worth remembering that the FCO and DFID development advisors left the PRT at least as often as, I would suggest, 80% of the soldiers to go on the ground when we could. This RUC officer said that one of the features that he'd noticed in his 30 years as a frontline officer in Northern Ireland is that where soldiers went, trouble followed quickly. I was disturbed to, slightly disturbed at your, at the hostility of your suggestion that some people might say that you went out looking for trouble. I think that's perhaps putting something of an unfortunate angle on it. But the truth is that it's very difficult as any kind of civilian development advisor, however courageous or not you are, to conduct any sort of advisory work in an environment where soldiers are fighting what amount to a number of raucous drifts a la 21st century. The somewhat bucolic view you take of development advisors, such as myself and my several colleagues, being able to go out on the ground with you on patrol and conduct anything like meaningful operations or meaningful work is frankly entirely implausible. Now, there's no question in that. It's merely a lengthy comment for which I apologize to those who've had to endure it. But I think on behalf of those dozens of my colleagues who are deployed forward to every single base now occupied by British and indeed American soldiers, I think I have to make this comment and make it rather firmly, that we're forward and we're not averse to risk. And there may be problems with FCO rules, there may be problems indeed with some of the other modalities we have to endure or had to endure. But I don't think any of us would accept the characterization that you've made repeatedly, that the civilian side of the operation is backward in coming forward.
Well, that's very interesting, because I think you should also speak to some people who have served more recently in Afghanistan. And of course, I'm speaking primarily, when I talk about personal experiences, to the situation in 2006. You were there some 12 months later, I believe. The first patrol we conducted, literally the first patrol, and I can't remember the date, but it was the anniversary of the Taliban coming to power, was in Goresh, and this is the washing machine story, which I won't go into. That's the first thing the paras did on the ground, and I see, so I listened to you, so please listen to me. I was always staggered by the fact that if someone sort of said, hey, Stuart, you got it wrong here, you know, you're a para, you know about fighting, you don't know about development. Let's go down to the hospital, let's have a look. This was Goresh. There was no real fighting in Goresh. I think we had something like 32 rounds fired against us in the whole of the tour, which is nothing. It's of no consequence compared to everything else that happened. It was a relatively, I use that term, benign environment. But no one visited the hospital. to actually see for themselves the soiled sheets, etc. And so my point is, without getting too emotive about it, is the fact that, you know, we had a ground view which the personnel from DFID didn't have. And when I sort of said, you know, I was pulling my hair out and said, look, I don't care whether it's us. We'll have a whip round in the officers' mess and find the money to get Afghans to go and do it. We'll dress up as Afghans and go and do it, however implausible that might have been. Just have an effect, resource the effect. And when I said, you know, look at that, we'll put the security in, you can come down to the hospital and then tell me that I'm wrong. And I was never taken up on that offer. And there was time, because it was before the 6th of June, when the fighting really started, and then very sadly we had no time, we had to focus. And I think I actually was clear, and I think hopefully the audience will back me up. I make no personal criticism of any individual member of DFID, because they were constrained by FCO rules at the time. That might have changed. But my point is, and again, if you take so much criticism, that I think DFID really has to take a look at itself and say, okay, what can we do to change what we're doing? And it was a DFID comment that said DFID doesn't do bricks and mortars, and I'm not attributing that to you. So I think DFID has got a long distance to go. That's not to say there aren't worthy people trying to do the right thing.
When you speak to effect, I was the justice advisor, and we were very much into bricks and mortar. One of the missions that we had planned was to visit the prison in Sangin. Thank you. Prison in Sangin. Speaking to effect, the visit, which was to take 30 minutes, was a company-level operation in order to provide us the security, simply to look at a facility, to look at a building. Now, regardless of the resource to effect calculation that might imply, my point concerning particularly security is that we simply could not, at that time, things may be different now, I doubt it, effectively work in an environment that is, as you put it yourself, a war-fighting environment. This is not a development environment.
Well, then that begs the question that, you know, we need to really think about how differently we're doing, because we've got to have an effect. And maybe I'll say one thing very briefly. I spoke to the MOD about flying up to the Sangin, well, going to Sangin, just as I left the army with Bill Neely, because Bill Neely had flown out and spent some time with us and had some very dramatic footage. And the plan was we'd go up there and we'd try and demonstrate, look, last time you and I were here, there's a big old firefight, now there's development, the bazaar's open again, etc., etc. And we pushed this quite hard with the MOD, and I thought, you know, hang on, we are giving you a good news story on the plate. And it just all became too difficult, seats, etc., priorities. And I thought, OK, fine, it didn't work. I saw Alistair Leithhead when he came back, and we were having a brew in Chatham House. And I was telling him about this and said, yeah, it's really disappointing. He says, sure, be quite clear. He said, they were not going to let you in with Bill Neely. They weren't going to tell you that. And he said, because you would go to look at the development effort, and although you said you were coming to make a positive story, you couldn't have but helped being negative. And that was round about November time last year when Alistair came back after covering the conflict in Helmand for 3 years. And he just said, you would see a school started, never completed. And he said, you're right. That the fighting, actually, the Taliban have been pushed back. This is a secure area. The development just has not happened. Now, I take that from the horse's mouth. So that was his view, third party. So I would suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that the development effort, and I, you know, not trying to point criticism at any individuals, is not where it should be in the war for the people.
Let's chat with his hand up over here, with a book in his hand.
Hi, Henry Gates. We've spoken a lot about development, and we've spoken a bit about security as well, but not much about governance. I was wondering what your view is on the FCO's effort to improve and increase governance in Helmand province in particular, and what the military can do and should be doing to help with that, perhaps with particular reference to security sector reform.
Well, I'm not an expert on the governance side. I mean, my experiences was it wasn't great. And that was just a reflection of the time with the governor who was brought in. And it's a big old problem, because if you don't feel that you're governed properly, and governance in Afghanistan's always going to be difficult. But I disagree with anyone who thinks that Afghans, and particularly Pashtuns, are pathologically opposed to some form of central direction from Kabul. The reason they are passionately against it is because there are no benefits from it. So I think that governance has to be linked to delivering benefits. So if you get a governor who comes in and he'll have to work that difficult dynamic of the privileges and the balances of the cultural dynamics of Pashtunwali code, who sits where with the tribes, but if they can manage that, but crucially bring some benefits, so whoever comes down, and whether he's a Pashtun or a Tajik or whatever, can actually turn around and say, no, I'm making life better for you and your people, but while also preserving the complex balances that work through in this particular area, slowly, bit by bit, then they can see a benefit of governance. But it's actually about ground truth leadership of people in the first instance, not coming down and trying to slap down some liberal democratic template with everything that they see. Individuals who make a difference. But some of the most capable Afghans are driving trucks for NGOs or perhaps being interpreters for the army because it pays so much better than being in government. And one of the major mistakes is, and a lot of money has gone into Afghanistan, is the fact that it hasn't necessarily been invested, which makes a difference to the people, which isn't just about bricks, mortar, food, etc., security, but is also people who govern them properly.
Perhaps Chirag Cooper-Coles would like to say something on that point.
I agree completely that governance is the key, and I really just wanted to underline the point I made earlier, that you know, the Helmand Valley is littered with goods that were delivered by the Americans in the 50s. The whole of Afghanistan is littered with things built by the Russians. In the end, these populations have got to secure and govern themselves. And they've got to believe that once we've gone, the Taliban are not going to come back, and those who've cooperated with us or a corrupt and predatory Afghan government are not going to be hanged for doing so. So I think your model, Stuart, I mean, I think DFID has got its act together. We've got 90 civilians now in Helmand, and as Frank said, in every single forward operating base. But your model that if only we gave these people goods, they would somehow come over and repel the Taliban. They won't until they believe they're going to be protected when we go and the Taliban come back over the hill. And the model has got to be empowering the Ulaswals, the district governors, to govern, empowering communities to protect themselves, and getting the police and the army in a position where they can come in to help, and creating antibodies to the Taliban, many of whom in Helmand come from among the people. And so General McChrystal is looking very intelligently at the whole model of clear, hold and build. The idea that you clear out an area when the population itself has the insurgents among them is flawed. It needs to be adjusted. The idea of holding an area by garrisoning it with men in uniform in little forts, now called combat outposts or forward operating bases, whether that is the uniform of the 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, the 82nd Airborne, or the 205 Corps of the Afghan Army, doesn't matter. These Pashtuns have never been kept down by men in uniform in forts. They hold, in the end, they hold themselves by holding them. And the idea that the building phase is building schools and clinics and roads, and that may be right, but it's really building the institutions of governance. The Taliban, the communists, have swept away the shuras, the elders, the maliks, and we need to rebuild them somehow. And there are no easy answers. Anyone who pretends to know is betraying his or her ignorance. It is extremely difficult what we've got ourselves into. And you're quite right, we shouldn't walk away. We went in with the best of intentions. But getting out again is not easy, and getting out with honor and not undoing all the undoubted good that has been done by Sarah Fain's organizations, by individuals, by governments. And just on the criticism why the British government isn't funding schools, well, the British government is funding a hell of a lot else. You know, we're spending over £4 billion a year in Afghanistan, and most of it on military effect. But our aid program, I think, does deliver and is widely praised for what it does. If you want it diverted to other private purposes, then you only have to lobby ministers. But it is I believe, doing a great deal of good.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 more questions. This chap in the blue T-shirt over there.
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering if you'd be able to talk a bit more about your reasons for leaving the army. I mean, you're clearly very passionate about the troops and the future of the army. And I mean, was it something in the leadership of the army or the political leadership that made you feel that you couldn't do more good with it within the army than outside of the army?
My reasons were many and varied. I mean, if I'm completely honest, I'd just finished the best thing I think any professional soldier can do, to command his regiment, and I had a particularly good one to command in terms of 3 para, and I took them on operations, on a proper war fighting, even if that wasn't the initial intent. So I was very clear that although I'd been promoted, that I'd stopped being the 20-year-old soldier that I joined the army to be. I was going to move away from that, go into staff jobs, and even if you command a brigade as a brigadier, you're higher up. So I was thinking about the rationale to stay. Suddenly my rationale, which had been unchanged since 21, suddenly changed as a 41-year-old. And I think a lot of people go through this at that particular phase in their careers. But at the same time, I had seen the consequences of the lack of resources, the consequences of the lack of robustness, which I saw in spades at corporal and section commander levels, but I wasn't seeing above me in the highest echelons of the MOD and the government. And then I think my moral compass was battered severely by the poor treatment of my wounded. When I went to Selyoke in 2006, I mean, I was shocked to the core by what I saw. And I'm not saying that for effect. Patrick's had access to my diaries. I was writing about the day after I went there. Now, there have been significant improvements to Selyoke. Not where it should be. Soldiers still in mixed wards. There are problems with compensations. Already I'm involved in an issue about trying to get a young soldier's car converted because he's lost an arm and 2 legs, and, you know, he'd quite like to drive his Subaru. Surely we should look at supporting that young 24-year-old, that particular, I was going to say luxury. It's not a luxury if you've just lost 3 of your limbs. So there are still problems, but they are better. But at the time I thought, you know, and even now I discuss it with senior people, and I look them in the face and say, how could we ever have let it get so bad? And why did it take such high explosive public political weight to change it? In the Walter Reed Hospital, I think in 2007, there were a couple of wards which weren't cleaned properly. 2 major generals were sacked like that, and I bet those major generals were resigning before they were sacked. It was just a different level of approach. And so a combination of all those reasons convinced me I'd had the best bit. I regret nothing. If I was an 18-year-old again, I would be down at the recruiting office signing up to join the parachute regiment, without a shadow of a doubt. But a combination of time, experience, what I was seeing at the time, came together and thought, actually, I need to go and do something else. Not actually looking to have a voice necessarily publicly. I didn't leak my letter. It was a very tight circle of senior officers who saw that letter, and it didn't come from me. But if, surprisingly, I'd been given a platform that can make a difference, and I would like to think that I can make a positive difference, then I'm going to take advantage of that, hopefully for the benefit of other people. And I'm going to brook some criticism for that. Hey, bring it on. It can't be any worse than what the Taliban threw us in the Sangin Valley. So that's fine. I don't know if that answers the question, but Patrick's gone, so he's coming back. There's a lady there with her hand up. Yes.
You referred to the Afghan as he a number of times. Can you explain what efforts you undertook to make sure that you heard the viewpoint of women on development priorities?
Sorry, can you say that again, please?
You referred to the Afghan as he a number of times, and I was wondering what efforts you might have been able to make to ensure that you heard women's views on what development priorities were. Second question, you've now written your story, which is in the public domain. There are many Afghans who've been through about a quarter of a century of the kind of war that you talk about. Can you tell us about one Afghan whose story you think should be told? And lastly, can you just say a bit more about civilian casualties? And I think we should all drop the term collateral damage, because as soon as we refer to human lives as collateral, then we've, I think, lost the battle for hearts and minds. what is the process for investigation of compensation when there are civilian casualties, and how do you ensure that relevant humanitarian law and human rights standards are met? And is there any space in that process for an independent body like the Afghan Human Rights Commission, which is quite an important body that Afghans have a lot of confidence in general?
A raft of questions, so because I probably forgot where you started, I'll start at your last question. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that that it is really important, coming on whether you use the term collateral damage or not, inadvertent casualties, that issue has some form of independent overview, and I think that's really important for transparency, and I don't think that there's anyone in the military or NATO who would disagree with that. In terms of, and I think I can remember your first question was, I referred to he, my apologies, it's probably a Freudian slip, but what I would say about that is I never spoke to an Afghan woman the whole time that I was in Helmand province. Had I have done so, particularly out on patrol, I would have probably caused the utmost offence, and that's putting it mildly at the end of the day. Women were fully veiled in the burqas. They would often flee from our patrols, and the reason they did that was so it was a very clear disassociation that they were talking not only to men who were not their relatives, but men from another country. So that's why they did it, and that's the way Afghan society is, like it or not, at the end of the day. So when I talk about the Afghan as a he, it's a Freudian slip, but one of the things that we did recognise was the importance of trying to get into the schools and talking to people, and actually getting the Afghans to talk. We set up a number of initiatives where we brought Afghan soldiers to say, because we thought it was far better that the Afghan soldier says what he's saying, because we realised that despite the fact that Afghan society is very repressive of their women folk, I'm pretty sure there are lots of Afghan women who are the power behind the thrones in lots of households. And we thought through the children, if we could access a message where they talk to mum at home, who turns around and says, this is what they've told us at school, then actually we would reach a very important part of society. Sorry, I might sort of hitting. So don't get me wrong. Although, yeah, Freudian slip. My apologies. You know, I'm a rough old paratrooper. But yeah, absolutely right. The female dynamic is really important in Afghanistan. But it's how that's addressed, how that's accessed. And I think if you build, you know, a meeting place for Afghan women, and that completely sits away from how women are chaperoned in a particular valley, a particular clan, isn't necessarily the best thing to do. And we shouldn't ignore that. And I mentioned female health care, which isn't the sort of thing you might expect a former parachute regiment officer to mention. So I do think it's an important dynamic, but it's a very, very difficult one to access. And I think if we set our standards on women's rights in a way that the majority of Afghans, and probably including some women as well, and I know Christina Lamb talks about this a lot, and so I do have a reasonable understanding from a woman's point of view as well, and I think Christina would agree with this, that there is a danger that actually you cause more trouble than benefit, so it has to be handled very sensitively. And that's my view from where I sit.
Okay, one last question. This chap here.
Hello. Why, given the nature of the Middle East, would the invading forces of 2001 assume that the Afghans would embrace democracy when every other country seems to be some kind of dictatorship or theocracy? And if so, why not? Why would the initial kind of war not be a massive punitive mission against the Taliban or Al-Qaeda?
Well, I think in punitive terms, that's exactly what it was in late 2001, Tora Bora, etc. In terms of, and I've mentioned earlier, I mean, I don't believe, and lots of other people don't believe, that you can have liberal democracy, and hopefully there have been hooks through what I've been saying, that you can't just slap a template on. I think you're absolutely right. I think the more interesting question is there an approach where you design a paradigm of how you approach a particular solution? So let's take Iraq. Maybe there might have been an option to turn around and say, we want to get rid of Saddam Hussein because we think he's a bad guy, whether he's linked to 9/11 or not, maybe is a completely different issue. But what we can't do is walk in and stop and say, there you go, over to you, liberal democracy, because that clearly didn't work. And if you were based in somewhere like Alamara in 2003, boy, you saw it on the streets every day. And where I think we need to be clever, and it's not enough of just suddenly saying, well, we think we've got this one guy, Ahmed Chalabi, and we're going to drop him in because he's a Shia, because actually there was a lot of thinking that wasn't done behind that of whether that was the right solution, and it didn't work. So I think you're absolutely right to highlight the fact that if the international community believes that there is a rationale to intervene into a rogue state, whatever it is, we need to think more cleverly and learn the lessons of whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, of what we're trying to put in place or support the indigenous population putting in place, and it's not necessarily going to be liberal democracy. It might be even some form of benign dictatorship. And I don't know, and you'd have to ask an Afghan this, but there's a side of me that says if you had strong leadership, whether it's in a valley, a region, a province, or Kabul, but it delivered benefit to the majority of the people, which, you know, as we heard, that the tribal dimension and the autonomous bit of that is really important as well, but it somehow married that up together, that might be far more successful than liberal democracy. And yeah, building on the shuras and the more traditional forms of tribal leadership are really important.
Just before we finish, can we have a show of hands on whether people think that we're achieving something in Afghanistan and we should stay there? How many people actually think that? And how many think we should get out? That seems to be completely the opposite of what the polling evidence is so far, the trend of the polling evidence, which I think the latest poll you talked about earlier on is talking about 2/3 to a third, 2/3 saying we should pull out.
And I would commend, very briefly, that one of the key reason for that is because I don't think our political leadership are doing enough to explain it to the people. You know, and it doesn't matter which side of the fence you sit on. I'm continuously met by people from a very broad spectrum of society who generally come down and say, I'm a sort of anti because I don't really understand. And I think that could be changed.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Stuart. Fascinating as always.